So good evening. So I'd like to ask everybody to please mute yourselves while I'm going to just do a review of what we did last time. And then we will begin with the new material, which is poetry. So let me share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to, there we go. So everybody can see this, I assume, right? Okay, so The Binding of Isaac, as you hopefully know at this point, is the story about Abraham being given the command to take his son up to the top of the mountain and to sacrifice him. And Abraham absolutely jumps to, attention and does it. He gets up early in the morning, takes him up there, is about to slaughter his kid until an angel of God says stop. So a traditional rabbinic interpretation is that Abraham is serving as an example to other people. So he's an exemplar of faith, of true faith, complete faith, zealous for God. And I didn't include Kierkegaard here, but Kierkegaard, talks about going beyond the ethical, which he considers to be a sort of bourgeois concept, to something way beyond anything that makes sense, and that's what faith is. So we looked at some of that, and we also looked at Midrash, where Hasatan, who's the prosecuting angel, attempts to block Abraham's path and he turns himself into a river, does whatever, and it doesn't matter, whatever the obstacle is, Abraham is able to overcome it and accomplish what his goal is. So he's so zealous that there's nothing that's going to stop him. That's the sort of literal meaning of the text, taken in a way that is lauding Abraham's actions. But then we have some possible questions about this. One is a play on words. Lo hasachta et binha. At the end of the story, God says to Abraham, you did not withhold your son from me, therefore, you're going to be rewarded. But a midrash interprets that as lo hashachta. You did not kill your kid. You did not offer him as a sacrifice, and therefore you're being rewarded. So this is putting into question whether Abraham really understood this test that he was being given. Emmanuel Levinas, who's a 20th century French philosopher, says that the beginning of the ethical is when Abraham looks into the eyes of his son and realizes, I can't do this. Now, for Levinas, the other person, in the face of the other, we recognize our absolute responsibility to the other person, and that's why Abraham couldn't kill his son. Then there's another midrash that also looks at, the midrash a lot of times will play on words, like lo hasachta and lo hashachta is taking a letter in Hebrew that looks the same, but it's pronounced differently depending on where the dot is. And since there are no dots or vowels in the Torah, you can kind of play with that. So here, the play on words is that God says, offer your son as an olah being a burnt offering. And it's spelled the same way as the word Allah, which means to go up. So God says, when I asked you to take your son, I didn't say take him as an olah, I said take him up. That's an Allah. You took him up, now take him down. So again, a question as to whether or not Abraham actually really understood his test. Rabbi Harold Schulweis, from the 20th century as well, says that basically if there's an order that appears to come from God and it's unethical, it's immoral, then it's not really from God. So the moral takes precedence over everything. And that Moloch, who's a pagan god, of course, does want you to sacrifice your son. And so he's saying that, Hasatan, the prosecuting angel, is able to disguise his voice and make it sound like Moloch. It makes it sound like our God, Adonai, Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh, but it's actually Moloch speaking. But that's an incorrect understanding. So there's this concept that Abraham misunderstood the test. And as we said last week, sometimes it's a question of, did Abraham understand the test properly? Did he hear God? Was it a test of God or a test of Abraham? The plain meaning of the text is he was tested to see if his faith was enough to do what God told him. And as I mentioned also last week, there's a whole long saga in Genesis about who's going to take on the mantle of leadership. And it's not clear, since Abraham and Sarah don't have a child for a very long time, who that will be. And they wait a very long time to finally have Isaac. So the idea that Isaac is going to then be killed is an odd request, since God has promised that Abraham will be the father of a multitude of nations. So that maybe Abraham understood that God was not going to make him do this, that at the last minute there would be a ram, but we're not sure. We're not sure. The plain meaning of the text is that he did what he was supposed to do. But there's a lot of discomfort with the story amongst the commentators, so they come up with ways in which they think maybe he misunderstood. And Schulweis says there are times when to obey the voice of God is blasphemy. An act of goodness is not good because God commanded it, but God commanded it because it is good. Then Leonard Cohen, a 20th century prophet, has a song called Story of Isaac. And again, it's a question of misunderstanding. I've had a vision, and I'm strong and holy. I must do what I've been told. This is what Abraham says to his son. And then I have some dispute with people about whether this is Abraham or Isaac speaking, but thought I saw an eagle. It might have been a vulture. I never could decide. Either it's Abraham saying, I thought it was one kind of bird, but it was another, meaning that he misunderstood. Or it's his son saying, I thought my father was an eagle, which an eagle takes good care of its children, but maybe it was a vulture. Like, here's my father trying to kill me. And then it's an anti-war song. You who build these altars now to sacrifice these children, you must not do it anymore. I mean, we send our young men to war. And for visions and concepts that we don't have to pay the price for, that we make them pay the price for. And of course, psychologically, we often sacrifice our children by insisting that they be or do what we envision they should be or do, when in fact, we should probably help them be who they are. In fact, that's the theme of the confirmation service next week. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is God's name, which means I will be what I will be, or I am what I am, and the kids really like that, and they are applying it to themselves. Then we have the whole story of Balaam and the talking donkey. So this is the story in the book of Numbers where Balak, who is a king and an enemy of the Israelites, hires a prophet to curse the Israelites, which is already a very weird thing to do. Like, a prophet's supposed to be telling us what God has to say, so you don't tell him what to say as a human being or as a king. But of course, Balaam ends up blessing the Israelites rather than cursing them. And in fact, when an angel of God is on the path to stop Balaam from going to curse the Israelites, his donkey sees the angel, but he doesn't, which is a kind of crazy thing because he's supposed to be a prophet. Why can't he see the angel? In any event, this particular rabbi, David Kasher, draws parallels between Balaam and Abraham. And there's some very parallel statements about, rising up in the morning and saddling your donkey and taking your two men with you. And then there's an angel that appears. And so for David Kasher, the story of Balaam is kind of a veiled critique of Abraham. There is a lot of infratext commentary that goes on in the Bible, so it's possible using the same words and the same kind of scenario is very possibly a critique. Then we have ways in which people understand what's going on here is God's inner struggle. So God is behaving like a parent who's got some real issues going on, feeling threatened, feeling that God must assert God's power and test God's child. And that is God's own internal issue in this particular case. But before we get to the poetry, I think there's also another, I didn't include that in this particular set of, I mean, I've got so much commentary on the Akedah, but there's also something about the repetition compulsion. So Abraham supposedly, according to tradition, went through 10 tests. And the first one is when he and his father are living under King Nimrod. Remember, King Nimrod is a pagan who believes in many, many gods. And remember that there's a story that people actually think is in the Bible, but it isn't, of Abraham going into his father's idol shop and destroying all the idols. And when his father comes back and says, well, you know, what happened here? Abraham says, oh, the idols were fighting over food, you know, with each other. And his father says, but they're just wood and metal. And that's, yeah, exactly. So they're not real gods. Anyway, so under Nimrod has a sense that this kid is trouble, that he's going to contest this idea of multiple gods and Nimrod's authority. So he sticks him into an oven. It's really creepy to think about that because this is like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And miraculously, Abraham is saved. The father is there allowing this to happen, right? He gets saved, but not by his father. His father, you know, is perfectly seemingly okay with having his kid thrown into the oven. So there are various people, including Aviva Zornberg, who say that this whole business of sacrificing Isaac is the repetition compulsion. You know, you keep doing the same thing over and over again to try to work out some psychological problem. So just as, you know, Abraham himself was virtually killed with his father present, he does the same thing to his own son. So those are some of the, all right, I got a statement here. Let's see. Could this story be a foreshadowing of the 10 plagues tests of Egypt ending with the killing of the firstborn son? Sure, absolutely. And actually, thank you for that interesting idea. And Patty, you had an interpretation. You want to share that with people?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of if you take the story, I've always been intrigued when God says, Abraham, take your son, your only son, the son you love. I mean, he kept repeating that, and he said, Isaac. Well, I think Abraham, I know a lot of people are thinking, well, if Abraham was talking to God during this time, which we don't know, he would say, well, which son? I have two. But I've always looked at it as when he says, your son, take your son, your only son, the son you loved. And if you just interject, yes, Abraham, Isaac, that's the one.
Oh, yeah.
And I got to thinking, could Isaac have been an idol to Abraham? Ishmael is gone. Abraham is now getting elderly, and Sarah as well, and they have their son. I mean, they have him, and I can see them idolizing this kid. And so for me, when God says, take him up to the mountain and whatever. He's trying to teach Abraham, okay, I have told you no other gods, you know, don't have any other idols. I'm it. And maybe that was a teaching moment for Abraham. I mean, we don't know really if he would have allowed Abraham. I mean, in the story, he didn't, but maybe it was just a teaching moment.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Don't I, and then we could just put our own selves in the story. Well, okay, what is your idol? I don't know, take your car, your only car, your favorite car, you finally got the little red convertible, and go smash it, or, get in a wreck or something, I know that sounds silly, but it's kind of in the same, what are our idols that we're putting before God?
Right. No, I think that's a very interesting idea. There is a midrash where you have, because Abraham isn't saying anything, right? Abraham is being told, take your son, your only one, the one you love, and clicks his heels and gets up early in the morning and goes to do that. So the midrash imagines a conversation with Abraham. Take your son. Well, I have two, the one you love. No, take your son, your only one. Take your son. So he says, I have two sons. Your only one. And he says, each one is the only one to his mother, right? Ishmael is Hagar's son, and Isaac is Sarah's son. The one you love, he says, well, I love both of them, Isaac. So it's almost like a bit of a delaying tactic, like take your son. Well, I got two of them, the one I love both, that
Rabbi,
could be one way to. Yes?
Rabbi, could Abraham partly say, when God says, take your only son, he doesn't know where Ishmael is at this point, does he?
No. He's been.
Has anyone ever accused Abraham of already sacrificing one son?
Well,
and sending him off in a desert
yeah.
with his mother? What chances has he got for survival, except this promise that he's going to be
right,
that they get from God eventually?
So
but he doesn't put up any fight about it. He just saddles them up and sends them away.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned this, that some people look at this as kind of a punishment for what they did to Ishmael. Like Sarah and Abraham both banish Hagar with her son and make her go through this near loss of her son. And at the last minute, there is the water to save him. Well, if you look at the story, and I actually wrote a paper about this, where if you look at the two stories, Chris, I think I'm going to turn off your microphone. Okay, because I think there's a echo of myself. So if you look at the two stories, they're very parallel in the way they're constructed. And so you can see the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, as a punishment for what they did to Hagar. They put her through something, and then they have to go through the exact same thing, a near sacrifice and a last minute reprieve. So maybe that's why he answers right away and is willing to do it. I don't know, but it's a very complex story. And I gave you a bunch of interpretations. Obviously, there have been hundreds and hundreds of years of interpretation of the story. It obviously bothers the rabbis from our tradition. And Nachmanides, who's the 13th century Spanish commentator, definitely is very unhappy with what he does here. He's one of the people who says that, what they did to Hagar was terrible, and this is a sort of payback. So anybody have any other comments before we go to the poetry? Chris?
I do.
Just hang on. Chris is, yeah, and then Jane.
Okay.
Do the Muslims also have a story about Abraham going up the mountain?
With Ishmael, yeah. In the Muslim story, it's Ishmael that's taken up there. And the Dome of the Rock is that rock where that was supposed to happen. Jane?
Well, I've been playing with another theory all week. And that theory is that the test is not for Abraham, but the test is actually for Isaac.
Ah,
Because Isaac is second generation. And God wants as full a commitment from Isaac as he got from Abraham. So I've just been tossing that around in my
interesting.
head.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go to the poetry and see what people have done. Teresa, let's see. Is this an archetypical story, archetypal story that exists in other cultures? Well, you know, in Greek mythology, and I'm not an expert in it by any stretch of the imagination, one does sacrifice one's child for, to please the gods, right? In the Trojan War, that's what happens. But Tantalus, I don't remember exactly what that story is. But I think, these are like archetypal stories generally, the idea of father and son and how they interact. And there's the whole psychological thing too of, now the father was a strong guy. Now the kid's getting old enough to challenge his father physically. And so there's this, Freudian desire to kill the kid, right? And vice versa, so the Oedipal complex. So it really plugs into so many layers of what our experiences are as human beings, which is why I think it's so genius. Hi, Michelle, you're luckily on the beach with a nice palm tree. Okay, we're gonna go on to the poetry. Okay, get rid of this. So the first one is by Chaim Guri. It's called Heritage. The ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question, first of his strength when his day was on the wane. The old man raised his head, seeing that it was no dream and that the angel stood there. The knife slipped from his hand. The boy, released from his bonds, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what pleasure had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts. Pretty powerful story. Trauma is transmitted, right? And Isaac certainly was traumatized by this event. And first of all, the two guys go down the mountain separately. They're never seen again together, except at Abraham's funeral. And Isaac is a weak character, right? One of the things he does is he redigs his father's wells. There's usefulness to that, but he's not an original thinker or entrepreneur or whatever. Rebecca, his wife, is a very strong woman who is often compared to Abraham because she's willing to leave her home to go off to a land she doesn't know. And she's the one who manipulates the kids so that Jacob becomes the next patriarch. Isaac is blind. Now, we don't know, is he blind really? Were his eyes blind? Now, some people say that God cried and God's tears fell into his eyes when he was up on the altar, and that's why his eyes grew dim. Could be. Or he's really blind because he's old and he's lost his sight, or he's blind in some other way, psychologically. Because it's a little hard to believe that feeling the skin of a goat, the fur of a goat, would let him think that that's his son, his favorite son, Esau. I mean, that's kind of unlikely. Maybe he, on some level, thought, well, Rebecca knows better. I'll let her do this. Who knows? We don't know. It's very terse. But, clearly the guy was traumatized. as was Ishmael, and the two of them do show up for their father's funeral. And so from there, I constructed a whole year of a class with a group of people when I was up in Oakland. How do you deal with a problematic parent when you're an adult? Hopefully it's not when they die that you finally come to terms with them, but sometimes that's what's necessary. But he certainly, I wouldn't get near him again, would you? After he tried to stab you on the top of a mountain,
But it was God asking him.
Right. Well, but as we said, from all of these different interpretations, did he hear God right? And even if you did hear God right, do you do that to your child? Yes, Chris.
We see abused spouses return on a regular basis, though. So
True. But in this case, we don't see him return. They don't go down the mountain together, and there's no scene where you see them together again. Now, maybe they were together, who knows?
right, but what I'm saying is it's not given that you would go back or not go back.
Right. I'm just saying in this particular case, but I had done a little drosh about the fact that the two sons were at the funeral, and that was the way they had finally reconciled themselves to the situation. And somebody came up to me and said, would you do a class on this? And so for about a year and a half, there were about 6 of us, and we would start with material from the tradition about how you treat your parents. And then we'd have something more contemporary, and then we'd spend time just talking about everybody's situation, because the Torah does not say you shall love your parents. It says you shall honor them. So what does it mean to honor them? And at what point is abuse something you don't take? The tradition doesn't say you put up with all kinds of abuse. So it opens up that question. And, if you want to say, well, God said to do it, okay, then, I think hopefully we're a little more nuanced in the way we respond to those kinds of demands by God. Jane, did you have something?
No, I'm
Okay.
listening. It's very interesting.
All right, so we're going to go on to the next poem. Okay, this one is by Amir Gilboa. Toward morning, the sun strolled out in the forest, together with me and father, my right hand in his left. A knife like lightning flamed out through the woods and the wood, and I was so scared of my eyes' terror, facing the blood on the leaves. Father, father, come quick and save Isaac, and nobody will be missing at lunchtime. It is I who am slaughtered, my son, and my blood is already on the reich of the leaves. And father's voice was smothered and his face pale, and I wanted to scream, writhing against belief, as I ripped my eyes open. And I awoke, and my right hand was out of blood and time. So here the Akedah is being used as a way to talk about the experience of the Holocaust. And in this case, it's Abraham who's being sacrificed. But of course, again, that is transmitted to the son. It's not trauma caused by the father, but it's trauma experienced by the father, which then the son is going to have to live with.
I have a question about that. Do you know how trauma is transmitted through generations? Do we know?
Well, apparently there is an epigenetic way in which it is transmitted. In other words, it's not just, your parent behaves in a certain way because of the trauma they experience and that affects you, which of course is one part of it, but genetically, it is supposedly transmitted from one generation to the other.
Hmm.
That's the latest kind of study about that.
Like, for example, the camps, or, the experience, the trauma caused by all that happened during the Holocaust. How is it transmitted through generations? It is in some ways clear, but how?
Well, as I said, supposedly it's transmitted genetically. And then since I am the daughter of someone who was in a camp, I can say that, you know, my mother's trauma, it was very clear in her behavior, in her emotions, in her relationship to me. So of course that affected me. And my sisters, of course, as well. And it affected their children in some way.
Right. That's why I'm thinking, you know, my daughter, for example, may
Yeah.
have, I think, may have been affected. I think she was. in some
Very
way.
possible, very possible. You know, it doesn't just stop at the, you know, at the generation that experienced it or even the generation
Yeah.
after that. I don't know when it stops,
Mm.
but, and I think, you know, you really have to go through a lot of maybe therapy or something to not really get beyond it. You know, like in my mother's case, I never thought that the therapy would necessarily help her, but at least I think the next generation needs to grapple with it, and the generation after that.
Mm.
But so it's interesting that the story about Abraham, you know, has so many layers of interpretation and of how it's being used to describe another kind of trauma. So any comments before we go on to the next one? Okay, we'll go to the next one. Okay, this is Yehuda Amichai, who is a very interesting poet. So he says, this is called The Real Hero. The real hero of the binding of Isaac was the ram, who didn't know about the collusion between the others. He was volunteered to die instead of Isaac. I want to sing a memorial song about him, about his curly wool and his human eyes, about the horns that were so silent on his living head, and how they made those horns into shofars when he was slaughtered, to sound their battle cries or to blare out their obscene joy. I want to remember the last frame, like a photo in an elegant fashion magazine. The young man tanned and pampered in his jazzy suit, and beside him the angel dressed for a formal reception in a long silk gown. Both of them looking with empty eyes at two empty places. And behind them, like a colored backdrop, the ram, caught in the thicket before the slaughter. The thicket, his last friend. The angel went home. Isaac went home. Abraham and God had gone long before. But the real hero of the binding of Isaac is the ram.
I love this poem.
So tell us why, Judy, I was going to ask you, since you're a poet, tell us.
Well, the way I take it, I love Yehuda Amichai, and his tone is so unexpected at times. Well, it's true that in the biblical text, there's not much thought given to the ram, which is one factor. And when Amichai says, who didn't know about the collusion between the others, the question is which others at that point? And is it God and Abraham? I mean, if that's collusion between God and Abraham until his hand is stopped, that's an interesting thought. It sort of exempts, I mean, Isaac is a victim. The angel seems to be removed from blame, but it's as if the ram has no volition. The ram's offered up, but doesn't get to assent or not assent, whereas Isaac actually assented to his own sacrifice. I mean, he was very compliant in the story, at least the words. He let himself be bound. So, but the ram, no. The ram has had nothing that he can say, and his eyes are called human, which makes him a kind of stand-in for something worthy. And then what's interesting about the rest of that first stanza to me is it seems to be an anti-military stanza, because battle cries, which are made with the horns of the ram, those horns are used to sound battle cries, and the cry of battle is described as obscene joy. So that seems to me, and it's not inconsistent with what I know of many of Amachai's poems, that it's anti-military. It's got this amazing thing in the next stanza,
Right.
which seems,
Yeah, what do you make of that whole business about the picture in the magazine?
yeah, it's, the tone of it is so wild. I mean, it's like a completely modern scene, a fashion magazine, a jazzy suit, a silk gown. It's like they're going to a prom, and forget the whole God and Abraham thing, you know, and they're looking at, with empty eyes, at two empty places. So it doesn't matter to them that Abraham and God, perhaps, Abraham and God are not part of the story here. They've got their own story. The emotional impression I get from it is, forget God and Abraham. That's not what we're concerned with here. And the ram, well, this part is obvious that the thicket was his last friend, because he was disguised in the thicket, or held back by the thicket, before he could be taken up and put on the altar. Then the angel goes home, Isaac goes home. Abraham and God had gone long before. So the emphasis is on Isaac and the angel, and they're the ones who are described as belonging to this totally different universe, the fashion magazine, which, again, as I said, I'm always saying the same thing. It's like, forget the God and Abraham thing. We're not interested in that. The real victim is the ram.
Well, it makes me, you know,
Hero.
I mean, first of all, the first part about, yeah, because ram's horns were used not just as shofars for Rosh Hashanah, they were used to, you know, call people to battle. So there are people who are sacrificed in those battles that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to. And I don't know, this glossy magazine business, I wonder if, I mean, I don't know, it's obviously very open to interpretation, but I wonder if it's about our consumerist society where more important values are sacrificed. You know, we care about how we look, and we have these like pretty lives, and what are we sacrificing in the end? And who?
The problem I have with that is the first line, I want to remember the last frame. That doesn't sound like an introduction to a negative, a negative antithetical portrait of Isaac and the angel in these costumes.
Except they have these empty eyes in the glossy magazine.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
But what are the two empty places?
What do other people think? Any thoughts about this poem?
I still think they're Abraham and God.
Could be. I mean, you have to know, Amichai is kind of, it's a little flippant.
Yeah.
You know, he has another poem where he talks about a talit, and then compares it to a big beach towel that you wrap around yourself.
I think he definitely is. Yes.
I think he does that purposely. I mean, I think he does have a certain rebellion against the tradition. And so he's okay with being a little blasphemous about stuff. He also has a poem about the closing of the gates on Yom Kippur, and compares it to the closing of a gate at an Arab store in the Shuk. You know, it's very jarring, and I think he's purposely, in a way, thumbing his nose up at it. On the other hand, he's very steeped in the tradition. I mean, all his imagery is from.
Absolutely.
You know, yeah.
I think he wants to almost revitalize the tradition by taking it into himself, you know, thoroughly shaking it up, and then
Yeah, I think so.
making it his own on his own terms.
And making you rethink what all these images mean. So, you know, closing of the gates, like, do we really think about what that means at a certain point? Because, We say it every year, right? But then if you think about the gate closing over an Arab store, oh, wait a minute, let's rethink that. Or, you know, the ram, hey, how come we forgot all about the poor ram? He got sacrificed. Or the talit, you know, you wrap yourself around the talit and it gives you a certain feeling or whatever. And then you think about it as a beach towel, you know, it jars you enough to rethink all of that imagery. He comes from a more, you know, fairly traditional background. So,
And he had mixed feelings about serving in the military, you know. Like
well,
what?
the military is going to play a very important role in this as we go further, because Israel is a country that, you know, without a military would not exist, and without sacrificing young men and women. So let's go on to the next one.
So didn't he write a poem about his father going to the shul on Friday night?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he did. Yeah. His poetry is wonderful. I mean, you know, he wrote a lot of stuff. Okay, so we're going to go down to the women using the Akedah. So this one is by Ra'aya Harnick. I will not bring my firstborn to sacrifice, not I. At night, God and I reckon who deserves what. I know and am beholden, but not my son, and not to sacrifice. No longer 1942, no longer Treblinka, no longer sheep for the slaughter. Now proudly, now like Masada, now sheep for sacrifice. God in his mercy builds Jerusalem every day after the meal, and every stone he built in his mercy in Jerusalem is sodden with blood and tears. I'll give to God in his mercy Jerusalem, and take my son in return. So,
It seems quite obvious compared to the others.
yeah, Amichai is more complicated, but here, you know, it's now we're going to get the point of view of the mothers. Not to say fathers don't have strong feelings about their kids, but it is, after all, Abraham was trying to sacrifice his son. So we don't have Sarah's voice in the Torah. So we get the women starting to say, wait a minute, I am not sacrificing my son. So we said we don't want to be like sheep to the slaughter, right? That's an expression that, you know, conveyed how some people viewed what happened during the Holocaust, that we didn't fight back. Well, there was not really an opportunity to fight back a whole lot. But we said we wouldn't do it. Masada is that last holdout during the revolt against the Romans, where people in the end committed suicide rather than be taken by the Romans. They have been glorified by the Zionists because they fought back. But all of that requires the sacrifice of human beings. And the fact is that people in Israel have to send their kids into the army. Everybody has to, except for the Haredi. So that's another story. But everyone has to send their daughters and their sons to the army and to serve, whether it's in a war on the West Bank, whatever it is. And that's a huge sacrifice to make in order to preserve the country. And it's a very difficult thing. So that voice is very poignant, I think. And any thoughts, comments about it?
You know, I think so often we have the female, the mother's voice that doesn't wind up being expressed on so many of these different levels. In Europe, it was similar with military service, and in Austria and in Germany, similar again with military service. And but it's always the women expressing it for their sons. And do we have to go ahead and why are we making this sacrifice? What is the reason for the sacrifice? We have sacrificed in the past. Why would we continue to sacrifice? And I don't want to make that sacrifice because I don't feel there's a reason to make that sacrifice. And I think if you look even in modern Israel within the, you know, I know that there are some who don't serve, but the fact that everybody, male and female, serves, even though there's an understanding from an Israeli standpoint of the inherent dangers and the position that they're in geopolitically in the world, that would be incredibly difficult. But I also think of it from Sarah's, I mean, when you think of it from this component, how this winds up working, from Sarah's component, or from, a mother in Israel, or, from a mother in Switzerland or in Austria for their kids going into military service. We don't often hear that voice.
Right. And I think that even if people accept the fact that they have to do this, it's still obviously very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
People have lost their children, or their children have been maimed, or whatever.
Well, there are those people who have refused, and they are a study in themselves. And there are whole books, one of which I read, which is a testimony of those who have refused because of what they're asked to do. And
or, you have people who have served who have turned around and said, for example, having to control the West Bank is something that we shouldn't do, because the fact is, the more militarized your society is, the more it affects who you are as a people. Not to mention the budget, but obviously a lot of the budget goes to that, but it also affects who you are as your identity as a people. Okay, so let's go on to the next one.
moral.
Okay, this is Natalie Zalat-Dayan. Okay. These words are not written. Sarah waited by the mountain where the man with a knife had taken the boy. Sarah worried. These words are not written, but we know they are true. Sarah waited for the son born late, for the husband consumed by a covenant that promised the unimaginable and demanded the unspeakable. The man with a knife. Sarah worried. These words are not written, but we know they are true. Sarah worried about the boy. That's what mothers do. And those who are not mothers worry about those who are not their children. These words are not written, but we know they are true. Sarah would not see the scrolls that bore their names. Genesis of a people who endured the unimaginable and the unspeakable, survivors and scholars, and strong women who changed the world as they worried about their children. These words are not written, but we know they are true. So this is an effort to provide Sarah's voice. There's actually a wonderful poem about the women at Sinai when the Torah was given. Kind of filling in the blanks, because their voices are not what is recorded, right? What's recorded is what the men did and what the men saw. But the women, what were they doing in the meantime? They were holding the babies, and they were changing diapers or whatever they had in those days. And they were doing all of those things that, occupied them and kept them from being fully engaged in the experience of the revelation, while the men were there, getting the revelation and writing it down. So this is trying to fill in that voice. Any comments, thoughts? Okay, we have one more, which is Zoe. Yes, Chris, please.
I appreciate having the voices brought forth. I have a 22-year-old son, and I remember contrasting. My brother was, so our family sat around waiting for what his draft number would be for Vietnam. And then having a dialogue with my son before he turned 18 about how he would register for the draft. And we talked a lot about the wars that the US has gotten involved in versus what Israel is trying to do. And as a parent, I told him how I feel, but it basically came down to he registered in the way that he came up with his own conclusion on how he was going to register. That's his story to tell, so I won't tell it here. But I just remember very vividly my brother making the decision that he was not going to go to Vietnam, and he went to the state of Washington so that he could be close to the Canadian border. Fortunately, he had a number that was very high up there, and they never got close to his number, but he was prepared to go to Canada and accept consequences for that decision. And he talks about that, and had him talk with my son about his decision, and also had him talk with some other clergy who, a variety of different clergy before he came to his decision. So I think that as parents, whether it's a mother or a father, trying to deal with these delicate situations is never easy. But and I think we're seeing more and more, I mean, a lot of commentary right now about the fact that countries that are being successful with COVID-19, tamping it down, reversing the curve, are being led by women. And so my point in all of this really is, I am glad that we're getting the voices of women heard.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's just really stunning how Sarah is not involved in this story at all. And as I think I've mentioned last time, the next Torah portion is she's dead. It's called Chaye Sarah, which means the life of Sarah, but it starts with her being dead. And so the Midrash says, if that's juxtaposed like that, it must be because Satan, again, the prosecuting angel, came up to her and said, hey, guess what just happened? And she died of a heart attack. Oh, okay. I didn't know where that was coming from. Okay, so here's the last one. Now, Zoe Klein is a rabbi in LA, and she writes a lot of poetry and prayers, and she's really very, very talented. And this is a meditation to introduce Akedat Yitzchak, which means the binding of Isaac. Take your son, your precious one, and offer him up as a burnt offering. Children, how many children are to be sacrificed on altars to false gods? How many children to be strapped with explosives, to be schooled over stockpiles of weapons? How many children to be bound to the altar of selfish agendas, offered up as burnt offerings? Children of the Yazidi community pulled into the desert mountains of Iraq, pushed off the sides of cliffs by parents who could not bear to watch them starve. How many children to be burnt offerings? Oh, kidnapped students, yeshiva boys, students of Torah, Nigerian girls studying to be teachers and doctors and healers, rounded up and swallowed up by the deep woods. How many children to be bound to the beds of terrorists, raped for the rest of their lives for learning to read? Take your daughter, your precious one, and offer her up as a burnt offering. How many children are to be sacrificed on altars of corruption? Journalists, humanitarians, beheaded before the idols of money and power. How many children gunned down by police, by firearms? Oh God, the lions are eating our lambs. Take our sons, our precious ones, and cuddle them in quilts. Take our daughters, our precious ones, and cradle them in comforters. God said to Abraham, take your son, your precious one, and offer him up as a burnt offering. And I say, no. I think that's an amazing piece. Because if you think about all the things going on in the world, I mean, daughters sacrificed because the Taliban doesn't want girls to learn how to read, or any number of those examples that you gave, you know.
you remember the name of the Nigerian?
Those were the Boko Haram, remember?
Boko
It was
Haram,
Boko Haram who
Yes.
kidnapped those girls, yeah.
Yes.
And there are so many horrible stories of you know, girls that have been kidnapped and gang raped until they died and those sorts of things. And I mean, you could throw in pornography too, where, you know, you use children to give yourself sexual pleasure and, you know, watch them being, you know, tortured or whatever. So, you know, we don't treat our children so well many times. So I want to hear from you guys now that you've seen all of this. How does the Akeda, does it have an impact on your lives? Does it speak to you?
Only if I take it as an injunction to not listen to a voice of authority unless I am convinced that what it's saying is the truth, desirable, ethical, moral. That's what it does for me. It makes me suspicious of authority for authority's sake.
Well, you know, I think I mentioned this last time as well, that it really speaks to me on a very different level, and that is, you know, plunging into the unknown. When I decided to leave television and go back to school, I really didn't know what it was going to lead to. I certainly had a rationale for doing it, but that really wasn't why I did it. There was something that was propelling me to do it. I had been fighting it for 10 years. And I just, you know, it was just plunging into this sort of free fall, not knowing where I would land. And I just knew I had to do it. And so to me, that's what this story captures. You know, just for me personally, it captures a lot of other things too. Of course, the issue of authority and morality and what are you hearing and what are you not hearing and all of that. But on a very personal level, it just really captured that.
How does it connect with the sacrifice of children?
It's not about that. It's about that going beyond the known. That, I mean, it's, you know, Kierkegaard's idea of you know, you go beyond the ethical to something unknown, and that's what faith is. And so it's a certain kind of faith, you know, that I you know, when I first started to think about doing what I've done, I thought this is crazy, you know, and I kept fighting it literally for about 10 years. And so, you know, I finally decided to listen to it, because what are you going to do, you know? And so it captured that feeling, that sort of awe, you know, it's sort of dread and excitement and everything at the same time. So it's more the feeling than the specifics of the story. But obviously there are lots of other ways of relating. Yeah.
For completely different reasons. Oh, sorry, maybe I should let somebody.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, for completely different reason, but I feel the current situation with COVID-19 and all the lies I think that are being told to us, or all that is hidden from us, which is similar. Because hiding and not saying, or not saying the truth, or not saying the whole truth, is very similar to me.
Okay.
I think
say more?
also, I feel like we have to resist, because we're going towards a totalitarian regime worldwide, not just in the US, but that's what I feel. And you accept one compromise after another, collectively or individually, then you get to it very quickly. But I don't know how many people feel like that. I think there are quite a few on the internet, at least, but who express themselves this way, because you only hear one voice. Basically, they shut down everything that's dissent right now. And I feel I see it because I listen to media in France a lot, and it's done systematically in the usual media, at least. Mm-hmm. And but I feel that we are in a situation of great danger.
Yeah, I agree with you. Other thoughts?
I had one on a very personal level, actually, after listening to everything that you've shared with us. When our youngest was in high school, he decided that he wanted to be in the military academy, which was completely against everything that we wanted for him. And the big one was that he really, really wanted to go to West Point, which was very, very challenging. And we had to get to a point of letting go and, in a sense, sacrificing our child to allow him to do what he needed to do to be able to get in these academies, and then go the next step and support him and give him everything he needed to be able to get the congressional nomination and to get the sports and to get the academics and everything that he needed. And in the end, he was given a letter from the Naval Academy and a letter from West Point that if you just try one more year, maybe we'll let you in. And he was accepted into the Coast Guard Academy. And he decided not to go into the military in the end.
Wow.
So there's this like similarity of we sacrificed, we let go, we let him do his thing, and at the very last minute, he pulled back.
Well,
So it's on this personal level for me.
I don't think you sacrificed him. I think you would, I think to me, the sacrifice is to force your child to do something they don't want to do. That to me, that's more of a sacrifice. Here, you know, allowing him to be who he was is a way to not sacrifice him. And then he figured it out on his own, luckily.
But it was very difficult to allow him to run that run.
Of course.
To not try and push that agenda that I had for him.
Of course. But see, pushing your agenda on your child to me is more sacrificing your child, because it's, you know, like, this is what I want. This is what's important to me. And so I don't really care what you want. Which
It's difficult when your child is coming out of a very pacifist household and tells you that they're very interested in going to West Point, and you have to go ahead and go.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's a lot of introspection that winds up coming into that, and a lot of questions of what's going on.
Well, good for you. Good for you for being able to do that. You know,
May I
that's
ask
hard.
if at the end he ended up doing what you wanted him to do to start with, or
You know, that's so interesting, because with him, he had his own, you know, he was his own driven person. And in the end, when you give up a full ride scholarship to a place like the Coast Guard Academy, you know, you have to go ahead and ask, as a dad, you just have to ask, you know, why when you've done so much work, you've worked so hard, you know, because it's unbelievable what those kiddos have to do to get into one of the military academies. And in the end, he said, I really feel that I want to go ahead and set my world here in California. I want to go ahead and do work at a university. I want to work in statistics and data analytics. And I think in 4 years, I'll be further ahead than if I had gone to the academy. And indeed, 4 years later, he was further ahead. And even to this day, he's in a place where he wants to be, and he has found his joy and what brings him passion and what brings him interest. But it's difficult when you're looking at, and especially with my mom who lost so many of her friends in Vietnam. And when the military came calling for me, my mom did everything in her power, short of moving us to Canada, to get me away from it. And so then here's my son wanting to go this route, and it was very interesting. And certainly no pressures from us. We let him choose his route. And in the end, even talking with him now, you know, this has been now 6 years ago, he is extremely happy with the choices that he made, even though there was a lot of sacrifice that was on many different levels. So,
Randy? Wait, I can't hear you, Randy. Wait a minute. You're unmuted, but your mic isn't working. Why don't can you type it into the chat? Because that's what Teresa did, and I'll read you what Teresa wrote. Okay, Teresa wrote, I wonder how this kind of trauma expresses itself intergenerationally through our foundational stories. Well, I think Isaac certainly showed us how it got transmitted. I don't know about his kids so much, but listen, I mean, the whole history of our people has to do with a lot of trauma, and I think we've all been affected by that. But okay, Ryan's going to help Randy. I'm gonna put. I found one other oh, I have to share my screen. I found another poem by a woman. Wait a minute. This is her name is Chava Pinchas Cohen. With my babe in arms and human milk lacing his life, at night comes beats and measured noises, trains. At some station on this earth, barefoot and powerless, I stretched out my arms. A ram's horns caught in the thicket, the whisper of earth to heaven. Hear and weave your mercy overhead like the shade of vine and fig. Pray, do not try me. There is wood in a thicket, a smell of fire, and the sight of smoke. You don't play hide and seek with mothers. With my hand out, I cover my eyes, my voice lost in a voiceless scream. Where art thou? So clearly this is also a poem about the Holocaust. I mean, the smoke, but I'm sure other things as well. Okay, Randy, did you figure out what's wrong? Can't hear you, sorry. Okay, sorry. Oh well. This is the joy of technology. There's always something. Another thing that like Rabbi Doug Cohen, who used to be in, well, it was San Bernardino and then Redlands, wrote a whole thing about leadership and the different kinds of leadership shown by different episodes in Abraham's story. Also, David Hartman, Rabbi David Hartman, looked at the difference between the way in which Abraham responded to the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the Akedah. And clearly prefers the Sodom and Gomorrah response. I mean, when God says, I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues with him. Like, wait a minute, you know, what if there are 50 righteous people, or what if there are 40? And yet for his own son, he doesn't argue. Any thoughts about what that's all about?
There.
Carolee.
I think that it was much later. Oh no, maybe it wasn't.
It was afterwards, yeah.
Which one was after which?
The Akedah is after the Sodom and Gomorrah story.
My whole thing. I was thinking that.
That ruin your story?
Yeah,
Your
I would.
interpretation?
Way, because if it was the other way, here he is newly attached to this religion and attached to God, and would do things that would not be normal for him because he was so obedient and attached. Whereas in Sodom and Gomorrah, he has now grown and understands that he can argue with God, and he doesn't. But if it's reversed, my whole thing is it's wrong.
Well, other thoughts about why?
Isn't this the same Abraham who led troops to rescue his nephew?
Yeah.
It really is a.
But isn't that
it's
before
bizarre.
educated also?
Yeah.
Yeah. So why doesn't he argue now when he argued before?
That's the question.
Yes, I know.
Well, I mean, is it because it's his own kid and he, you know, somehow can't argue for his own kid, but he can argue for other people?
It was good.
That is probably true, in part.
I mean, that's one.
Harder to argue for oneself than for others. At least I feel that way.
It's easier to argue for others?
It's easier to argue for others. Because
Yes.
yeah.
Why?
But another thing I think is he maybe understands that it's a test of his faith in God, and whereas Sodom and Gomorrah, he was kind of independent of that. It wasn't connected directly to it, so he could argue more easily.
Mhm.
But here, you know,
Well,
if
his,
he
his
says
nephew
no,
was there.
right, okay. Yeah, he has the nephew, you're right.
Nephew's
Chris?
That's true. But I feel, you know, like it's your son, it's just your son. Then it's really the test.
Chris, yeah.
I'm reminded of books that my kids had when they were little that allowed them to make choices along the way. So if you think the story is going to go this way, turn to page 10 instead of going straight through, etc. And I think about this story a little bit in that way, that I continue to think that Abraham was testing God through this, and
Are you gonna really make me do this, right?
yeah, and so got to the point where the story took a different turn, because we never really got to see what Abraham would have done. Would he have actually followed through? I don't think he would have.
He was pretty close to it. Although if you believe Levinas, when he looked into the eyes of his son, he couldn't do it, but the angel had to call him twice.
So for me, this whole story brings out the concept of needing to question and authority, and don't just because Rabbi Singer says to do something, you know.
Yeah, no one listens to me, that's for sure.
You know, it's like there's no one on earth that I would listen to, and I've heard God talk to me, so I've got to use different faculties to try to discern what's going.
Right, exactly. We've been given those faculties to try to discern. Exactly.
There's also there's no prophet around to set Abraham straight. There's no Nathan around, or Elijah, or
He's supposed to be a prophet.
Jeremiah.
Yeah, well, he's supposed to be a prophet himself. But let me just read a couple things. So Teresa says maybe he didn't want to give up his role to his son, right? That's the whole sort of Freudian thing of like, you know, your son's now strong enough to challenge you. Okay, Randy. During the Vietnam War, I asked, oh, please. Sorry. During the Vietnam War, I asked the pastor of our Lutheran church to write a letter on my behalf, as I wanted conscientious objector status. My father never said anything, but the pastor's letter stated that the Lutheran church did not object to that hideous war. 20 plus years later, I was having a heart-to-heart with my dad, and he acknowledged how my desire to seek objector status hurt him deeply. He felt that my objections were a slap in the face to his military service. In actuality, I thought it was an unjust conflict and had nothing to do with him. I would have objected whether or not he was in the military. I told him that I'm sorry he held on to that for decades, and in no way was my decision a reflection of disrespect or dishonoring him. Did he understand that in the end? You believe so? Okay, I could read your lips when you said I believe so, but the rest of it I can't read.
Tell her that. Talk loud. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Randy, you're gonna have to write it in. Sorry. Okay, I found another one that I'd like to share with you. This one is by Stephen Pierce, who was the senior rabbi at, can you guys mute yourselves? Because it just reverberates. So Stephen Pierce was the senior rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. He's now retired. Aching Isaac. So this one's focused on Isaac. Aching Isaac, remembering the long days and nights before the last journey's mountain ascent, flashing silvery knife, bleeding frightened ram, fire's pungent smoke, blood-stained hands, old man's mutterings, youth's disappointment questioned, Abba, are you all right? The stammering old man talked to God, to aching Isaac, to himself on ever foggy nights. The Abba who struggled with son, knife in hand, rope at side, wood piled high, is not the Abba who once held tight this now grown child. Yielding pasty gray hands hold ruddy arms, while supplanted Abba weeps in thickets of confusion, concealing seed time harvest. Embarrassed, aching Isaac chronicles a more noble tale. So here the idea is that the old man is getting kind of senile and gaga, and doesn't seem to know what he's doing anymore. I mean, there's just so many ways you can look at this and interpret it. It's just really amazing. Oh, sorry, I thought Patty was trying to unmute herself.
Do the patriarchs show real affection for their children?
That's an excellent question. In a certain sense, like we know that Isaac preferred Esau and Rebekah preferred Jacob. Now, that doesn't mean they were lavishing, affection on them, but it certainly indicates some kind of love. Abraham and Sarah waited for so long to have a child, right? And they laughed when they were told they were going to have a child. But no, I don't think there's any real demonstration of love. This is, a modern, what I just read is obviously a modern interpretation. You have a father who loves you when you're a little baby, when you're a little boy, and then when you grow up and have your own ideas, like I don't want to go to war, and it hurts them, right? It doesn't mean they want to kill you, but it's not, you have a conflict that you didn't expect to have when you were a different age, right?
I wonder how the Israelis see this. Do you know? I mean, it's certainly for a country that's been at war since its founding.
Well, I think those poems by those women, they're all Israeli poets.
Oh.
So clearly it's very, very difficult, for them because, yeah, war is part of life in Israel. Chris?
In response to the question about did patriarchs show affection for their kids, I think if we look at the fact that Torah was written by men and over generation after generation, men have been told that you don't demonstrate that. You don't, there's this very different expectations that thankfully now are starting to change a little bit. But if indeed they did, I would never have expected them to write about it and admit it.
That's a good point. So what I'd like to do is just invite you to think about the stories in the Torah. They're not all this complex, I don't think, but I think the Torah has just so many layers and levels of meaning. And I think that's why it's a sacred text. Now, a lot of literature is like that as well, but I think that those who wrote the Torah really plugged into the profundity of what it means to be a human being. And this story in particular, just really, I find to be incredibly powerful. And I'm sure there are other stories, there may be other stories that speak to you more than this one. This one happens to really, speak to me. So I really invite you to think about the Torah that way and to look at a lot of interpretations and ways to understand it, because even though the plain meaning of this story is really sacrifice your son and get rewarded for being willing to do that, that is the plain meaning of the text. The fact is we are not a biblical religion. We are a rabbinic religion. We are a religion that follows how the rabbis have interpreted things for us and continue to interpret them. And they really believe that the Torah is written in such a way that these interpretations are meant to be uncovered. So I don't think we're just being fanciful to say, oh, let's turn this word around and it doesn't really mean this. He didn't really mean Allah, he meant Allah, or he didn't really mean, sacrifice your son, he meant withhold, or whatever it is, So the rabbis feel that that's exactly what we're meant to do with this material, because we live in a different time and there's a way in which this material is supposed to speak to us for the different times in which we live. And that's what I think is very exciting about studying Torah. So does anybody have any last words?
If there's no settled science, there's no settled Torah.
No settled
But
Torah. Oh, I'm sorry. Randy did finally type in his response. Dad was so wounded by it that I tried to do what I could to affirm his military service as worthy of respect. We purchased an inscribed tile years ago that remains to this day at March Airfield Museum with his years of service. We wanted him to view our support tangibly while he was alive versus after his passing. A photo of that tile was displayed at his funeral as a living memorial to him. It's really nice. Thank you for being so open about that experience. Listen to Anat and others tomorrow. I can't, but other people may want to. You want to tell them about it? Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I had I don't have it right in front of me, but tomorrow morning, our time, Anat Hoffman and some other names that I recognize but don't remember are talking about the new government in Israel. Ought to be an interesting discussion or presentation.
If people are interested, I can forward the email to you. So email me if you're interested and I'll let you know. Also, does everybody have this handout, or David Kroll, I assume, does not, because he was not here last week. Michelle, do you have this handout?
Colloquium online tomorrow. What time is it, Tov?
I don't remember what time it is.
In the
But,
morning?
it's asking about the handout of the
Which handout?
I showed tonight. Are you interested in that?
Which handout?
All that material that I was showing.
Oh, yeah, I would be interested, yes.
Okay. David, you want a copy? Just go yes or no. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Oh, you don't have it, Carol Lee?
I don't have.
Okay, I can't tell what David's doing. He's just smiling. Okay. I'll send it to you. You can throw it out if you don't want it. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you guys for, coming twice to hear about this. And
thank you, Rabbi.
It's a very,
Thank you.
very exciting story. So we'll see you soon for study on Saturday morning.
Thanks,
Yes,
Rabbi.